Hey everybody, this is Aubrey Chavez from Faith Matters. For today's conversation, we spoke with Fiona Givens and Britta Ellwanger about a remarkable journey to Ukraine that they just returned from. When Russia launched its attack on Ukraine, Fiona felt an inspired pull on her heart to help this situation however she could. That led to an inspired series of events that took her to Britta, and in the last 2 weeks to Poland, and then into Ukraine itself, traveling with Britta and helping to get humanitarian aid to the end of the road as the crisis deepens in Ukraine. We'll let Fiona and Britta tell more of the story, but they were also kind enough to explore with us the implications that our faith and our covenants might have when it comes to our engagement in humanitarian crises or other large-scale issues. We also talk about how we can help when it seems like so many things are going wrong all at once. Many of you know Fiona and her work well, but for those who are hearing her for the first time, she's the author of several books, including All Things New, which was published by Faith Matters last year, and The God Who Weeps, both co-authored with her husband Terryl. She was born in East Africa and educated at Catholic boarding schools, later doing graduate work in European history. She's taught French and German, and has worked as a lobbyist and communications director for a nonprofit. She has published in the Journal of Mormon History, Dialogue, Exponent 2, LDS Living, and with Routledge Press. She's a frequent speaker at firesides and women's conferences. Until February 24, 2022, Britta Ellwanger was a graduate student at the National University of Kyiv Mohyla Academy in their flagship anti-corruption studies program. She has switched to full-time humanitarian aid until the war is over. She has been living, working, and investing in Ukraine for 10 years. She has a BA from Stanford University in political science. Britta's organization For Peace focuses on the frontline needs of this war because it's the first piece of the domino effect that leads to the refugee crisis. Britta's written an article on Faith Matters website that gives a really up-to-date synopsis about the situation on the ground and gives actionable ways to help the effort on the front lines through For Peace. You can find that article and our other published material on the war in Ukraine at faithmatters.org/Ukraine. Thanks so much for listening, and with that, we'll jump right into the episode.
Okay, Fiona and Britta, thank you so much for joining us. It's really a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You have both had a remarkable few weeks and months related to this crisis, this war in Ukraine. We'd love to hear, maybe to start, how both of you ended up involved in this and hear more of the story. Maybe, Britta, could we start with you and how these last few months have gone for you?
Mm-hmm. I got involved in Ukraine 10 years ago when I got called on my mission there. And right when I finished my mission was in 2013 in October. And that was right when, like a month later, it was at the time called the Euromaidan. Now they refer to it as the Revolution of Dignity, but that's when, the revolution happened. They kicked out the old president who had gone back on his presidential campaign promises to have Ukraine not enter the EU, but sign a association agreement. And before I took my leave of absence from undergrad to serve my mission, and I had been a poli-sci major focusing on the Middle East. And I just, after my mission, it was like, okay, I'm very interested in keeping on learning about Ukraine. And with everything that was happening, it just felt very relevant. And so I switched my focus in my degree to Ukraine and Eastern European politics. And then, finished up my undergrad, started graduate school in the States, focused on Ukraine again. And then that's just kind of been the past 10 years has been on and off. Figuring out how to be in Ukraine, how to study in Ukraine, work in Ukraine, and then other life choices that took me elsewhere for a little bit.
Okay, and then how about the specifics on these since January?
Yeah, so since I was enrolled in a master's program at a university in Kyiv, and it's an anti-corruption program, and so I was living in Ukraine. It was pretty much around, I want to say since October of last year, that there was growing observations about buildup of the Russian military along the border with Ukraine. I remember it was kind of in December, maybe even earlier, where there was, increasing rumors, not even rumors, but just statements by the US government or other governments, there's going to be a war. And you just kind of, I'd be walking around in Kyiv with my friends and it's do you think there's going to be a war? I don't know, maybe. And then you move on with your life and buy a chocolate bar. And then, I remember we started our second semester of university in January, and there were increasingly there was, political escalations going on in Moscow. They had the meeting amongst his cabinet where they decided to officially bring in the Luhansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic, and to incorporated into Russia. And I mean, this was all happening like live while we were taking classes over Zoom for COVID. And I remember, even there were talks about evacuation plans, about like know where your bomb shelter is. And I just remember we got like texts from, if you know, like Klitschko, the famous boxer. So he's the mayor of Kyiv. So we got texts from Klitschko being like, Kyivans, like, know your evacuation plan. And our teacher was just like, evacuate where? And laughed. And then we moved on with our lecture.
Wow.
So that was January. And then I had gone to visit my dad in Israel because that's where he lives for his birthday on January 18th. And around that time, before I left, there was rumors about embassies already not secretly, but quietly evacuating their employees. But they were denying it publicly. And then finally, when I was, about mid-January, when I was with my dad in Israel, was when the U.S. Embassy officially said like that they were in talks about evacuating, and they recommended that any American civilians leave Ukraine. And so I didn't know if I should take it seriously or not. I asked a friend of mine who was in the military what he thought, and he told me that I should leave. So I just kept on postponing my flight. And then, I was kind of like living in limbo in Israel for almost a month. And then it got to the feeling where I thought, how long do I live in limbo? I should probably go back. So I was looking at flights to return and woke up at 5 a.m. to the news that Kyiv had been bombed. And even what was kind of more surprising was the first day of this escalation in the war, because the war has been going on since 2014. But, it was very clear, Putin really made the message on the first day, this was a full Ukraine war, because he bombed on the western border as well. So.
Wow. Yeah. And Fiona, I want to get to how you two met up, but can I just ask you, when this all started, is this what you imagined that war would look like? Because I think one of the things that was so jarring to me is that I have this, and maybe thankfully because we've been so separated from war, forever, living very safely in the middle of the United States, that I have this image in my mind of like open battlefields, which I don't even know where that would be, and soldiers fighting soldiers. And it was so disturbing to see that war looks like bombing apartment buildings.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, like, to right away just watch something that was more terror than anything else. Like, this isn't, for the most part, a war. I mean, there are front lines and there's battles, but it's war crime after war crime after war crime. And that is shocking.
Yeah, so scary. And so I know we're going to kind of jump around, but Fiona, let's talk about how you and Britta met up.
Well, when Terryl was teaching at the University of Richmond, there was a young girl who was interested in joining the church. Her name is Erin, and she ended up joining, and of course she promptly became part of the family. And so our relationship was just blossomed. She's a beautiful young woman. She had served her mission in Russia, and she said that, I don't know how Britta came into the conversation. It must have been after the invasion, but that she was really, really close friends with Britta in the MTC. And she had a book club. She has a book club. She lives in Salt Lake. And together they raised enough money to keep a bakery going. Was that in Mariupol?
Mm-hmm.
In Mariupol. And I was just so impressed with how little could achieve so much. And anyway, she invited me to a Zoom meeting with Britta and her mum. And it was then I just felt this, not urgency, but it was sort of a deliberate, you need to get involved. And I wasn't sure how to get involved, but I just knew that I needed to do something. And then, like with Britta on the 24th, I don't generally watch the news because it's so depressing, but I was riveted, and I have been riveted ever since. So there's something about this war in Ukraine. It's another European war. And so that rings familiarly uncomfortable. Europe tends to be ravaged by European wars, and so it was just, this is my home, this is my place. I need to do something, and I just really loved what For Peace was doing. and that's how it started. And I fell in love with Britta immediately, and her bravery and everything that she was doing to help alleviate the suffering in Ukraine really struck me as this is something I really would like to become a part of.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, I think we want to commend you both for incredible bravery and courage that you've shown, and we'll get into your more recent trip that actually took you into Ukraine itself. But maybe to set a little more context for that trip, could you talk about what For Peace does and what its mission is?
Mm-hmm. For Peace was started in the early 2000s, and its first kind of location that it worked in was Cambodia, and it focused on post-genocidal reconstruction there. And its main project was, instead of like micro lending, it really focused on microfinancing, which we believe it more focuses on like really empowering those and not putting them into more debt. And with this microfinancing program, and then a couple of craft-focused, initiatives of employment, whether it was silk weaving and making silk products to metalwork. We were collaborating with a local organization called Tabitha Cambodia that got 500,000 people out of poverty. And then from Cambodia, it expanded to working in Israel amongst Bedouins in the Negev desert, and also Arab Israelis in the Nazareth region. From there, it expanded into doing more environmental projects and environmental sustainability projects amongst high schoolers. And then it went back into Cambodia to do rainforest preservation in one of the final rainforests in Cambodia. And we had been ever since, so the For Peace was started by my mom. She's the director. And so after my mission, we started like a little project in Ukraine that was helping crafts women and men kind of in the Western area. It's a little bit more economically depressed. And so like we helped a woman who makes ties in kind of traditional Ukrainian patterns. And then another woman who is really talented in like hand weaving in traditional Ukrainian way, vyshyvanka it's called. And then another kind of guy who does handwork. So.
And so this assistance was through microfinance?
That was more just helping kind of provide a platform for their own businesses. So that didn't use the microfinance process.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, method.
So I'd love to hear how, as this conflict sort of evolved,
Mm-hmm.
what role did For Peace start taking?
So then after February 24th, I was in Israel, and the first couple of days, you're just doom scrolling and, trying to keep up on everything. I don't know, in America, do people use the program or platform Telegram?
Yes.
It's kind of like WhatsApp or Viber.
Yeah, I think around here it's actually used in the technology communities, especially like crypto, stuff like that.
Okay,
but yeah,
okay.
I don't think it's widely used. But
So Telegram is like very used in Eastern Europe, and it's where like you get your news, you're on multiple chats for your volunteer group or whatever. Like my school is almost like entirely run on Telegram. But yeah, so there were just like my Telegram just exploded, and I kept on joining more and more channels, just kind of seeing different local grassroots efforts, recommending where to help, where to put money or not. And then I just remember reading, and it was just such a fascinating angle into like what war relief looks like by locals. Like it wasn't anything having to do with big orgs. It was just like 3 people in Lviv who are manning the train station and trying to help already with refugees, or getting food into areas where there already wasn't something had been hit, and so they needed water somewhere. And then I remember when I started reading about like there would be a couple people like, hey, so like this really big org like just kind of dumped like 6 tons of stuff at the train station. We don't really know what to do with it. And then you'd get like, Pasha being like, I guess I have a truck. Like I could pick some of it up and bring it elsewhere. And then it was like, but I don't have gas money. So can like someone send me gas money?
Oh, wow.
And I don't know. It was just, I remember reading and being like, wait, what? That's what aid looks like? And these are like big aid orgs. So at that point, I just thought, I remember like that was like, okay, wow, this is what, we see big aid, and we just kind of see the sort of like the external view, but it was just so interesting to see like, oh, like ultimately this is all volunteer run and it's just kind of placed somewhere. I mean, this is also, this is first week, 2 weeks, so it's really chaotic. Logistics are just being figured out. I had a couple of friends who, I had one friend who was a Fulbright scholar in Ukraine, and he had been evacuated out into Poland. And obviously Poland is like still now one of the most affected by the refugee crisis. They've taken in almost 4 million Ukrainians. And so right away, like that just became a hot border. And there was a lot of need just to translating and helping house, Ukrainians that were coming in. And so as I was just kind of sitting in Israel, like reading the news, the question just kept on going like, okay, well, like what more can I do? And this is where Erin, Fiona's friend, comes in, because she was like contacting me constantly. This girl is just, I was so impressed that this like girl in Salt Lake City was like, hey, Britta, like you're the one that's living in Ukraine. Tell us what we should do. I have this book club. They want to do things. So I remember early on, it was like, okay, like I'm on these different volunteer chats. I can tell you right now, like this org is trying to keep this bread factory going in Mariupol, which as we know is like been occupied. I mean, it's one of the most biggest tragedies of the war. And yeah, like a book club in Salt Lake City kept one of the bread factories running until like full occupation happened.
Wow.
And I was like, I remember when I got like the first day, this stage, I wasn't even doing it for peace. I was just Britta, the girl that was living in Ukraine, and people like asked me what orgs I recommended. And so they were sending me on Venmo. And I just remember when I first got, donations, I was just floored that people trusted me enough to like send it on. But yeah, I hadn't really thought of connecting it to For Peace at all. And I just kind of thought my friend John was in Warsaw, and talking to him, he was like, Britta, like you speak Ukrainian, like there's something for you to do here with refugees. So I first just decided to go and just see what I could do at the shelters. At the very least, I could help translate. And then, within like the first, but then I just also, because of these Telegram channels that I was part of, I just had direct line of contact and saw, again, like this just really interesting grassroots element to like how Ukrainians were doing aid and how they were helping themselves. And so just very quickly, I naturally was part of these supply chains of like different, because the way that the war is right now, there's the official military units, and then there was this explosion of what's called the Teroboroni, Territorial Defense Forces, and it's essentially just like volunteers who are locals, and they've been called, they either volunteer or they've been called to help out, but like they have no training in the military. They obviously have no equipment. The military also doesn't really have equipment. And so it was like, just like, get these guys camouflage, like camo clothes, get them body armor, get them shoes, get them socks, like get them, and this is freezing. This is like February, which in Ukrainian February is called luty. And that means like it's like the word, like the word is like freezing. It's terrifying. Like it is a cold month. So for these guys to be standing outside at checkpoints, like guarding against a Russian invasion was insane. Like they're really just wearing sweatpants and, a scarf. So just all of a sudden I was in Warsaw, and I just knew the contact people to go to. I would go to army surplus stores and kind of purchase that. I remember like walking in as like this little girl to the army surplus store, and I was like, hi, I'd like to buy these. And the guy totally disregarded me. And then I came out with like $10,000 worth of stuff, and he was like, okay, I will deal with you customer. So yeah, and I just, we brought it to the contact lady who was responsible for the Kyiv-based Teroboroni in Warsaw. And then within a day, she had the bus that brought it in to the guys. And like, the whole way that it works with Ukrainians when you're sending an aid is like, you get kind of photo verification that the aid was received and that they're wearing it, that it wasn't stolen or lost or whatever else. And so I remember like the next day, like I got this picture of like these guys who were wearing the balaclavas we had, that I had fundraised for, thanks to like Erin and these original wonderful people who decided to donate money. And then, they had their thermal underwear, they had gloves, and I think like it honestly just sort of slowly happened that I realized like, wait, this is like a Ukraine relief project, and everything's in place to just have this be a new program under For Peace. And so I talked to my mom about it, and we set it up, and I became the manager of it.
Wow. That is so amazing. So now you're continually just feeding these supply chains.
Yeah.
So basically transferring the relief from the border to the front line.
Yeah. I mean, we get it also from, so there's things that are already not readily accessible in Europe anymore. So that's where we get it from the States, bring it into Poland, and we get it through we declare it and then bring it through and deliver it where it's been asked to be given.
Wow. So Fiona, would you want to talk about your experience going on this trip recently? What how you decided to do that? What you saw and some takeaways from that?
I just felt this imperative to go, and I'm still trying to figure it out, whether it was a mad Irish speaking or whether it's my dad on the English side, go in and do something. Yeah. But I gathered together a group of women from our ward and said, this is what I'd like to do. And Britta had told me that the supplies that they needed, primarily first aid kits, tourniquets, and chest presses, as well as also the decompression needles. Decompression needles, because when you get hit in the chest by shrapnel, it obviously oftentimes collapses a lung. So those are really, really important. So this group of sisters was terribly excited. It happened before that. On the 24th, I just felt this incredible feeling of, it was a really low point in my life. I was really struck by how this invasion was affecting me. And I realized that prayer on my own wasn't going to help. I just knew that this was something so much bigger than myself. So I called our Relief Society president, Heidi, and I said, do you think it would be possible for some of us women to get together and have a prayer for Ukraine? And it sort of started from there. These beautiful people came in. Everybody explained why this had affected them, why they thought that this was important in their lives. And then I asked a friend of mine who lives just down the road if she could come. She was in Park City. It took her the time for us to wrap up, and she walked in. And then everybody offered a prayer. I said, I can't pray for everybody, express your concerns. And then she prayed finally. I had no idea she'd served her mission in Ukraine. And she prayed in Ukrainian. And suddenly that made it very real. That connected us immediately with Ukraine. And then I felt that there was something we had to do. And the sisters all gathered together. We managed to get enough material for 6 huge duffel bags in a week. It was in an incredible short space of time because I knew I had to leave at a certain point. And so I booked my flight and then I left. I was in San Diego for speaking engagements with Terryl. And so over the weekend, these women got all of the supplies together. They packed them. It was just extraordinary the amount they did. So essentially, I just had to come home and pick them up. A friend of ours had a truck, took us to the airport, negotiated with Delta about could we have, not quite pay the full amount for for all of those things. And after those discussions, I got a free bag. And so that was something.
How very generous of Delta.
Yeah, that was something. But yeah, and then it was on my way, and Britta's mum, Margaret, was waiting for me in Warsaw. And the week was filled with extraordinary experiences, which I could never have done. I could never have gone to Kyiv or to the south if it hadn't been for both Britta and her mum and their contacts. And it was just amazing to meet these people who were seeing Ukraine in the future. So they were planning soccer leagues and cleaning up the environment. And they were just thinking through the war to the end when they would be able to truly integrate their communities into all of these beautiful projects. But the faith and the hope and the sheer goodness of these people were absolutely overwhelming. And then we toured 3 hospitals, a regional hospital and then a maternity hospital. And that brought it home to me when he said, okay, these wheelchairs in the hallway are for those women who are in labor. So if we should get bombed, we can't get them to the basement fast enough. So we put them in the wheelchairs in the hallway and they should have enough protection. I mean, that sort of thing it just really got to me. And then in the last hospital, we met this beautiful neurosurgeon And he took us on his rounds. And so we started off watching 2 soldiers go through an MRI to pinpoint
Shrapnel.
the shrapnel. And he gave this really beautiful testimony, is that what we have to do is ensure that these boys are wearing body armor, because there's nothing one can do with shrapnel wounds. He says it goes in and then it destroys everything inside. And so this particular man had been wearing his body armor, and they discovered a piece of shrapnel in his side, which was easy to take care of. But he made this really beautiful, compelling plea that we need to protect. He called it protective clothing. We need to protect the Ukrainian soldiers, because if they're not protected, then and they are killed, there is nothing to stop the Russian troops from moving into their wives and families and decimating the civilian population.
Wow.
We're talking about war crimes on a really malevolent level. So it was extraordinary. It was just an extraordinary experience for me, and particularly to meet Britta and watch how she worked and the connections that she had and the trust that she had from people. And I realized that this, for me anyway, this was the way to go, because I knew I was getting into Britta, and we watched it. So we had a truck full of supplies that left, where did we start from? I can't remember. Left Warsaw.
Well, it started in Salt Lake, right?
Started in Salt Lake. Yes, it started in Salt
The
Lake.
REI's around town.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Yeah, Warsaw.
And then Warsaw, and then we just followed the shipment as it moved across the border, moved to Kyiv, and then down south, and then we watched it being unloaded and
already delivered.
And delivered
I took
to the
pictures today.
recipients. Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Wow.
And the heads of these different aid organizations coming to pick up the food, and then our supplies went to the front lines.
Can you talk about just what you saw following the truck? Like, what does it look like, and where do 4 million refugees go? Like, did you see the shelters, and just talk that's so hard to imagine.
Oh, no, but did you see any? I don't think you did.
No, I didn't see.
Yeah, so there was like the supply chain relief world is like a totally different thing than refugee work, and so I don't think Fiona saw any refugee shelters. Yeah, when I first moved to Poland, that's where I would work and stay. So there's some really big. Basically, they've converted like big warehouses and sort of what are they called? Like industrial style malls down on the border into these massive shelters. And there's just kind of little cots set up. World Central Kitchen is there providing hot food. There's like a medical tent. I'm blanking on how many border crossings there are. I think there's like 6. Anyway, so there's a shelter at each of these crossing points. And ideally, you want these people to, they come in, maybe they'll stay for a day or two while they're figuring out transport. Some of them know where they want to go. Many of them don't. They obviously, very few of them have the finances to, their lives are totally destroyed. I would honestly say, like, refugee work is so difficult. It is just horrifying to see people at that state of their life. Like, to watch 60-year-old retirees who, they're finally on pension and they should be happily living their lives out in their little cottage, and they're standing in a line with, styrofoam plates to have one hot meal in an overcrowded building. It's like, it's really debilitating, and it's really hard to, it's hard to like keep energy. I find that supply chain work is just like, because you're bringing aid in, and there's like a little bit more energy with it. There just seems to be like a little bit more hope. Like most people, a lot of aid workers kind of end up switching between the two, just because you need sort of like one provides a little bit more hope and relief for you. Although I don't know, the realities of supply chain relief are also pretty difficult. But yeah, I mean, refugee work is hard because it's just, we don't know when this is going to end. it is such a massive project. Like, what do you do to help people, completely relocate their lives and resituate their lives, find new jobs, have a home, and mentally they've been in survival mode getting across the border. And so usually when you're at the shelters, like, that's their first time they're sitting and they're processing what happened. There's a room in the shelters for those that have experienced sexual violence. You just viscerally feel and see like how vulnerable refugees are. Like the experiences you have where, again, like as a translator too, there's probably there's a big conversation we had about the politics of refugee centers. I don't know anywhere, especially in Poland, like there's very little state help. So it's mostly volunteer run. There's very few people who can translate, at least when I was there. And so for a shelter that had about 500 people, there was probably 3 or 4 that could translate for these people and figure out where they needed to go, help them figure out where they could go, help them, because you have this, I'm sure you've heard about it. There's a lot of members of the church who are, taking vans and going to these shelters, offering to take them wherever they want. But you need somebody to translate what those options are. So, yeah, I just remember there was, you're running around, like you're inundated by people who are like asking you where they need to go, how to get there. You're trying to help explain where they could go. And then I got this like little tap on my shoulder and I turn around and there's like maybe a 14-year-old boy. And he like, has me like bend down and then he whispers in my ear and it's just like, we need to get to Spain. And I turn to his mom and I see that he's communicating in sign language with her. So his mom was deaf and mute. And this entire process is up to a 14-year-old boy who only speaks Russian. He's from Donetsk. So like this guy has since 2014 been experiencing the war. And like, honestly, even that itself is just like, oh my gosh, like a 14-year-old boy is in charge of his family getting to Spain. I contact, like, there's like a little desk. At the time, things in the shelters change really fast. Again, because it's volunteer run. It kind of depends on the internal politics. Like whichever volunteer ends up being the better organizer kind of sets it up to be how they want it to be. So at the time that I was there was just this central desk in one of the big halls. And then there was a guy on a microphone like there's a bus to Munich. And maybe someone hears it and says they want to go. Wow. Maybe they miss it. Anyway, so I go up to this table and I ask, like, do you guys have anyone going to Spain? They're like, Spain? No. And I was like, okay, well, when was the last time there was one? They're like, honestly, I don't remember there being one. And so I was like, well, can you call the other the other shelters like across the border? Maybe there's a guy from Spain or a driver from Spain there. So I was just kind of talking with the other drivers and transportation options around, and there were some very helpful Germans that were, saying, oh, well, we can take him to Munich, and then from Munich he can take a train here and here and here, and finally he'll get to Spain. I was like, he's 14. He only speaks Russian. Again, like his mom is deaf and dumb. It's like, what? And I just remember at that point, like I walked off and I was just like, I think I got to get this guy like a ticket, like on a plane, like this. I don't know what to do with this guy. Then like I heard on the microphone, someone was like, a bus to Spain. And so I ran there and I was just like, where's the Spain bus? and it was just like this total mystery. Miracle. It was just so unbelievable to then, be able to that same day have this boy and his mom safely go to Spain.
Oh my gosh, amazing. I would love to hear from both of you how your faith activates you. It's clear that both of you felt so inspired to really get to work, but I'd love to hear how you connect that back to your faith.
Well, for me, I think we're a universal church insofar as God is our Father, and he is the father of all humankind. And so I've always had this feeling of being connected to people within and outside of our faith. And I knew that what was happening in Ukraine, I just felt that I had to do something to help. It ended up being a massive, I don't know that I helped at all, except that it was such an educational experience for me. But this idea that and while we were there were miracles happening every day. And it was like God is among these people. Just little things, but they were happening all the time. It's like God is moving, his spirit is moving. And that just suddenly made it a holy venture. And to be able to do anything to help in this part of the vineyard. And then also, it's our baptismal covenants. It's not to say that millions of people aren't doing this in Ukraine and all around the world, but for me, there's particular power in those covenants to carry each other's burdens, to mourn with those who mourn, and comfort those who stand in need of comfort. And maybe it was that call I was listening to, but it really was beautiful, because we found ourselves in quite a number of situations where we were comforting, and in turn being comforted, as Ukrainian women primarily would come and say, we can't believe you are here, that you are spending your time to help us in Ukraine. It was really quite an extraordinary thing, but it was wonderful for me to be able to live these commandments in a way I hadn't been able to live them before.
Yeah. Britta, any thoughts on how your faith has played a role?
I definitely have stayed really committed to Ukraine since my mission, precisely because of my faith. I loved my mission experience, but I felt that it was kind of like the spiritual body for for actually realizing something physical and material as a change and positive. I love the standards that we get in the church, but I feel like they are immaterial and kind of theoretical. And then it's obviously the reason why we came to the earth was for this physical realization and manifestation of our faith. And so I appreciated the experience of sharing the gospel, but in a country that has that level of inequality, that level of corruption, just when you have a sense of global inequality and the fact that we are just lucky that we were born in the States, and it's other people, in different countries across the world, they just end up being, with no choice of their own, born into much more difficult situations. I just felt I remember it was in a district meeting on my mission, and we were talking about inequality, and one of the elders made a comment of well, it has to do with a pre-earth life diligence and righteousness.
Yikes.
And I was no. But I remember I had this just image in my head of one of the purposes of life is to bridge. It's to be a bridge, and to make sure that if there's something that's a lot in one country, you got to distribute it elsewhere, and share it. And so I really did I committed myself to Ukraine after my mission, because I felt like Ukraine provided me this unique ability to see life from a different socioeconomic level, and to have unique people living in that world that I didn't necessarily have in the States in my nice, comfy life. And I was grateful for my mission, and I was grateful for the gospel, but there was very real things that people needed. And that was what needed, that was kind of the next step, was they don't just need the Book of Mormon, they need better jobs. They need better, but there's things that our our global financial world is responsible for causing in Ukraine. And you see it with the conversation about sanctions. Our Western world looks as nice as it does because of the way we've set up the financial system to allow oligarchs to exist in Russia and Ukraine, and to allow the politics there to be as they are. So I think that we are responsible, and I just think faith is more than spiritual values. I think that these spiritual values set us up to have morals, and then it's very concrete things that are more economic and more political that we have to realize to actually live up to that faith.
Yeah.
Wow.
Let me ask. Okay, and I asked this question with I guess with a sense of it's coming sort of from a place with a lot of privilege. Like you said, our lives here in the States are in many ways, or for many of us, not everyone obviously, but are nice and comfy,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the reality. And I say this with that in mind. If you look at it from the perspective of what the average American or Latter-day Saint news consumer is seeing in the past couple of years, it's pandemic, and then it's war in Ukraine. There are other global crises, but then there's shootings happening. The last 2 weeks there have been separate mass shootings in the U.S. And like in an ideal world, we all sort of stand up and stay really like thoughtfully and faithfully engaged on all of these really difficult issues. And again, this point comes from a place of such privilege that I'm saying it with like a ton of like self-loathing. But like, how do you like it can be exhausting and overwhelming and difficult, and it's not difficult compared to refugees like who are leaving their homes, and it's not difficult to compared to people that have just lost loved ones in shootings. But from the perspective of the relative ease with which we normally live, it can seem like a lot. So what does our faith encourage us or require us to do in the face of so many different crises and challenges that we're confronting?
I think that's a brilliant question, and I'll just jump in. I think there are so many cases as there are people, and I feel that we're all called to do something, and just sort of the entire output of people engaged in different areas of alleviating suffering, poverty, and that sort of thing. We just listen. And for me, it was a very strong call to Ukraine. I've only felt this one other time in my life, but that's just me. It's something that I felt that I really needed to do. But there are millions, billions of people around the world. And I think for me, it's being able to hear that call, and different people are called to different areas, but there's some of our collaboration, even though we don't know each other and aren't aware, is what alleviates global pain, because there are so many areas in which it is felt as excruciatingly as it is now in Ukraine. So for me, I just feel that we are called to different areas. We do whatever we can in those areas, but the joint work of humanity in trying to build a place where there can be peace, where there can be a global Zion, where Christ can come, is universal. And I think very beautiful. Each person on our planet has a role.
That is beautiful.
That reminds me of, I think it was President Eyring years ago that talked about sudden feelings of sympathy, that somehow that's how our heavenly parents communicate to us what we're supposed to go and do. It's those like sudden intense feelings of sympathy that just are uncomfortable. But when you think of those as an impetus for action, then it is really a powerful experience to recognize that like something is pulling on your heart for a reason.
Yes, absolutely. And for me, I'm not entirely sure what the reason is, but just to witness the beauty of people's souls and the miracles that were happening, just to feel that God was embedded in this awful situation. And like the last day, this is where I saw the Spirit moving. So there is this elderly woman. Her husband died in January, and she had a stroke during the invasion, and she was going to Warsaw to be picked up from her daughter who lived in Amsterdam, but her son had come to see her off. She was sitting right opposite us, and she stood in the corridor for a long time, just he and she having this quiet conversation of farewell, which may be a permanent farewell. He is not allowed to leave Ukraine, and one doesn't know for how long this will continue. But then in the carriage right opposite me, she's also diabetic, and she collapsed. And just to watch Margaret, Britta's mother, and Britta and myself as we just gathered around, I couldn't do anything, so I just sat behind her and stroked her hair. But Britta was on the phone with her son, going through the medications, And there was somebody on the train, an employee on the train who came by, and they weren't sure that she needed to get off. But that was the last thing in the world that would have been good for her, is to come off that train and not know anybody and nobody know what she needed at the time. So that was really beautiful. And then they called for a doctor. And the very next stop, a doctor and a nurse got on board and checked her. And Britta had given her the right medications because her Ukrainian is that good. And it was just so beautiful to be there and then watch her being reunited with her daughter at the other end. That was a magnificent experience for me to watch people in Zion answering that call. And when I'm talking about Zion, I am talking about global and the concern in the whole carriage for this woman by all of the people who were sitting there. It was a sacred experience, I have to say.
Wow, it sounds that way. And I love the idea that like maybe that's how we see God's hand showing up in this conflict, as much as we'd like for there to just be peace, like peace demanded.
Yeah.
That it's beautiful that there are ways that we can see God's hand still.
Yes.
I also really sympathize with the question you asked, and like you minimized it and said that, it's not the same as watching someone die or everything else, but like I think that's not to minimize the fact that like you described an existential crisis that has been the question of all of philosophy since philosophy began. And I think we all have a personal experience with feeling at a total loss with like your empathy and your concept of wanting to be responsible for certain things in life, and then also just having no idea what to do about that. And then like you can't stretch yourself thin. And I know like very seriously, I have been like in a low place for like 10 years with that exact same question. It's just like, what do you do when you acknowledge you have an obligation to humanity, but there's so much to be like responsible for? And I do feel like as Fiona touched, like I think that there's something to be said for everybody has your specific thing to do, like in your specific sphere, and like localized elements of activism are not tiny or isolated. Like a tiny book club in Salt Lake City they felt the call to do something in Ukraine. And then there was just this link between me and a girl. Erin is someone that I have very minimal contact with. We were in the MTC together for a month. I've honestly seen her in person like once after that. For whatever reason, we just kept in touch. And then all of a sudden, like the war happens, and this little book club could like fund a bakery in in Mariupol, which is going down in history books as like one of the greatest desecrated cities of all time, and one of the biggest like, human rights crimes of all time. But like a book club in Salt Lake City provided bread there for as long as possible. And I don't think that there is something where like, I don't think everybody has to feel responsible for Ukraine, but I still think that if you're reading about Ukraine, if you're feeling concerned, like there really are ways to be involved, and they're surprisingly close by, and they're also like little things just aren't little in the end, and little people aren't little in the end. I feel like I've just been pounded by this realization, and like almost you could say a testimony of this since I went to Poland in February. But I mean, the coincidental ways that I just ran into little person after little person after little person, and then like For Peace just expanded. I mean, in the beginning, like I was just shipping out a couple of boxes of hemostatic bandages to Donetsk, to a volunteer hub that was then giving them out on the front line. And at this point, like through just friends of friends and friends and trying to help fund them, get whatever they needed, we ended up meeting this like unbelievable contact. And now we're like massively on like a scale of hundreds of people providing life-saving aid at the front line of like a front line of the war. And it's just all done through a bunch of little people doing what they could, and then like the power of just connection. But yeah, it's been really beautiful to see the ways that like it doesn't matter how far away you are, just wanting to reach out your hand and say like, this hand is here, it wants to do something, like that is way more than enough. And I just think we sometimes overcomplicate it. But I also think there's something to be said like, you're not responsible for everything in the world. And you are like, I don't know. I think we go through existential moments or years, like, desert times and droughts. I don't know why we have to experience that and like feel so useless for so long. But I think like a time does come where whatever you've been doing comes together and you're prepared to do something that really matters.
Yeah.
Wow.
I love that. And maybe some of the doctrinal underpinnings of that idea could be found in, out of small and simple things are great things brought to pass, or the worth of the soul is great in the sight of God, And if you were going to go like really cliche, like sacrament meeting talk, the starfish analogy, right? Like these little things, even if they're little on a global scale, man, they can really matter to
And I just
people.
love how it feels like such a great act of faith to do the one thing you can do, like to offer your hand and trust that something will come of it. Like God will connect you to the next thing if you just start. Sometimes it's just that paralysis that we have to break to get like the faith moving, like to get the energy flowing and the miracles flowing.
And I think oftentimes we're looking at massive things, and these are the things I need to save Ukraine.
Right.
And it's like, okay, that's going to throw you into a profound depression for a very long time, probably until the war's over. But if you just say, I like this, I think it's a beautiful analogy of the book club. Okay, we can do this one thing.
Yeah.
We can provide enough funds to help this bakery. And you have everybody all around doing that one seemingly small thing. But the accumulation of those small things leads to something really quite extraordinary, which is exactly what you're saying. And I think for me anyway, these scriptures sometimes become very repetitive and they just become platitudes. But I lived that this last week, seeing all of these people involved in trying to make the environment better in a really industrialized city where it's
cancer is one of the highest rates in Ukraine.
Yes, yeah.
Wow.
It's just extraordinary. And then including children, it's just extraordinary. And these different people with their different, and people might say, well, what does that have to do with the war? It has a lot to do with the war, as particularly with children, engaging refugee children. So they'd come out and they've got this beautiful new soccer field for all of these, children to play. It's just extraordinary to me. And I just felt a privilege to actually see that working. Everybody was doing that bit. And that bit might seem to them so little, but it isn't. It's absolutely enormous. And you put that all together, and truly it's an extraordinary thing.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your experience. I think this feels like a spark, that will give all of us this perspective of this orchestration. It's motivating to think we can just do this one tiny thing and trust that God's going to orchestrate this to become something beautiful and actually and helpful. And it's just wonderful to see how that's played out for the two of you over the last few months now. Yeah. So thank you so much.
Yeah. Really appreciate both of you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a privilege.
Okay, that's it for today's episode. We really hope that you got a lot out of this conversation with Fiona and Britta, and we hope that you're as inspired by their courage and love as we are. We want to send them a huge thanks for coming on. And as always, if Faith Matters content is resonating with you and you get the chance, we would love for you to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you listen on. We read all of the reviews and it really helps us to get the word out about Faith Matters, and we appreciate the support. Thanks for listening, and remember you can check out more at faithmatters.org.